I think that we would all agree that there are several perspectives from which we can view the history of Minoan civilization. Yet one of the most dominant and appealing narratives in the history of research is the one that places the island in the middle of the Eastern Mediterranean, exploring Crete's various interconnections with other Mediterranean centers and regions and the impact of these contacts on the development of Minoan culture. My basic aim today will be to show you that even after more than 100 years of very intensive research on this subject, it is still sensible and important to discuss Crete in its Mediterranean context, as well as the manifold aspects of this interaction. My observations will be based on my current work. It has been already mentioned in the Heidelberg Cluster of Excellence, Asia and Europe in a global context, in the course of which we try to apply some recent theoretical advances on transcultural phenomena on the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. This is the theoretical part, and to a lesser extent to the results and insights of our work on the practicalities of Aegean seafaring, which were presented in the exhibition Islands of the Winds at the University of Heidelberg. Let me start by explaining you why I think that it is still possible to make an original contribution to this amply discussed topic. The main reason is the one-sidedness of research in the largest part of the 20th century. Helen Cantor's The Aegean and the Orient in the second millennium BC, which appeared in 1947, focusing on the interregional circulation of artifacts, images, and styles across the Mediterranean, was definitely a benchmark. This very influential article may have been an admirable pioneering achievement, yet it had not only a positive but also a negative impact on research in the second half of the 20th century. For several decades, archaeologists following Cantor have been trying to pinpoint the origins of artifacts, images, styles, and techniques and map their distribution in the Aegean and the Near East, having the illusion that they interpret a phenomenon by simply describing it. Only in the past 2 decades, there is a new awareness of the complexity of cultural interaction, which puts several crucial aspects of this phenomenon into proper perspective. If we really want to reach the individuals behind the objects we are studying, then we have to focus not only on the simplistic questions of origins and distributions, but on the role of geography, social structures and institutions, of the different milieus of cultural encounters, of the agents, the materiality of the artifacts, and last but not least, the significance of perception and consumption as conscious human actions. It is therefore apparent that what we need is a more comprehensive approach that encompasses all these parameters and provides a more suitable analytical frame. And since it is impossible to discuss the entire range of these factors, I would like to focus in the next couple of minutes only on some of them, trying to delineate the hermeneutical potential for future research. I would like us to proceed from general to specific by discussing first the geography, in this case the maritime element, then structures and/or institutions, then to come to the agents and the milieus, and to close with a focus on the things. This chain of intertwined factors begins with the Mediterranean Sea and aspires to elucidate how the maritime element shaped this very specific character of all other parameters in the given geocultural setting. The maritime element. The heart of the matter was the sea and its ambiguity. The Mediterranean Sea divided as well as linked. It was dangerous and a force that could not be easily controlled. Crossing the open sea was always a risky endeavor. For those, however, who were willing and able to do that, the long-distance maritime trade opened endless opportunities through its advantages in terms of cost and speed. Our modern maps give us a rather distorted impression of space and distance, since they correspond to the Euclidean, that means geometrical, concept of space. However, taking into account that a Bronze Age ship, in the case of a smooth voyage, could cover a distance at least 5 times faster than a land transport vehicle or caravan, one should calibrate our maps adhering to the concept of hodological space. Contrary to the absolute uniformity of Euclidean space, in which distance from point A to point B is the sole determinant, path space or hodological space corresponds to the various geomorphological, social and psychological parameters which determine the factual human action and experience during movement between two different places. If we now perceive the Mediterranean basin as a hodological space, sea distances shrink and Crete comes closer to the Near Eastern world. Yet even in this case of this calibrated map, we must not forget that crossing the open sea remained an extremely risky endeavor. In a nutshell, due to the ambiguous dynamics of maritime contacts, the sea did serve as an important unifying force, yet only for those who were able to take this risk. The cultural ramifications of this ambivalence of sailing across the open sea as the fastest, yet at the same time most dangerous means of transport can be elucidated by a terminological distinction suggested by Arjun Appadurai in his speech for the opening ceremony of the Heidelberg Cluster of Excellence in 2008. Appadurai distinguished between circulation and connectivity, whereas circulation refers to the frequency of maritime contacts and connectivity to the intensity of cultural interaction. In the case of Crete and the Eastern Mediterranean in the second millennium BCE, we can assume a high degree of connectivity due to the regular diplomatic and economic contacts fostered by the desire of local elites to acquire foreign knowledge and possess foreign objects, yet only a low and unbalanced circulation, low at least compared to terrestrial communication in the Aegean and the Near East, due to the geographical distance and the unstable character of long-distance maritime contacts. This structural ambiguity, which corresponds to the environmental ambiguity of the maritime element, shaped the peculiar type of Bronze Age Mediterraneanism. On the one side, an extremely high interest in foreign objects and the desire to possess them, and on the other side, a rather limited knowledge about their specific functions in their land of origin. This ambiguity determined to a considerable degree the perception of foreign things which reached as diplomatic gifts or trade commodities the Aegean region. Now, the structures. At a regional level, the cabotage, the small-scale coastal trade, resembled the main form of maritime interconnectedness. For numerous local populations throughout the Mediterranean history, cabotage provided the only possibility for acquiring the indispensable means of subsistence. However, at a supra-regional level, in the context of long-distance maritime trade, the arteries of contact were exploited not by coastal traders, but by highly specialized sailors and merchants, and by the major political institutions acting from the background as the employers or partners. Only a very strong private enterprise, a very rich merchant, or a state institution could have engaged themselves in overseas exchanges, and more important still, could have ever financially survived the loss of a cargo like that of the Uluburun ship. The high degree of connectivity thus remained a privilege of the elite. If we want now to try to be more specific in our Minoan context, we can assume, and here you see some finds from the Uluburun shipwreck, we can assume that these institutions must have been the palaces, or the so-called palaces, which engaged themselves both in diplomatic and commercial exchanges, as it has been very clearly demonstrated already in 1928 by Antonios Keramopoulos in his groundbreaking article «Βιομηχανία και το εμπόριο του καύμου» in Archaeology εφημερίδη from not 1928 but 1930. Keramopoulos was referring, of course, to the Mycenaean palaces, but they can be, they resemble more or less the Minoan ones. Now, the agents and the milieus. The first thing we have to stress when we turn our attention to the agents of this cultural interaction is that due to the intricacies of long-distance maritime trade, only a very small percentage of the population ever had the opportunity or possibility of acquiring a direct knowledge of a foreign land by visiting it. Modern scholars who work with distribution maps have the opportunity of a bird's eye view covering both sides of the Mediterranean and tend to forget that the vast majority of the Minoan population could not see things from this perspective. The latter, the Minoans, possessed only fragmentary knowledge about Egyptian or Near Eastern societies and their material cultures. In these sophisticated webs of exchange, goods and knowledge were circulating in very narrow and fragile channels frequented by sailors, merchants and emissaries who were willing or obliged to take the risk of crossing the open sea. Rulers and high officials were rather immobile due to the significance of their position, and they apparently never crossed the open sea for visiting a foreign country. Since trade took place in a more regular rhythm than diplomatic gift exchange, the more active role in this transcultural interaction was occupied by specialized sailors and merchants. The still popular belief that the transmission of cultural knowledge was heavily determined by the explicit or tacit knowledge of the persons actively involved in cultural interaction, in this case sailors and merchants, is a rather romantic view, since the primary motive or motivation of these persons was probably nothing else than profit. Given the fact that virtually none of these goods bore a ceiling and only a few of them a sort of a brand mark documenting their place of manufacture or authenticity, their value or price depended largely on the stories the sellers not only knew but also fabricated. This does not apply, of course, for some classes of artifacts like the Egyptian scarabs, stone vases, or hippo ivory here that were imported regularly in Crete, perhaps even ordered by the Minoan consumers. Nevertheless, we cannot say how much Minoans did know about hippo ivory, for example, an exotic material which was highly appreciated on Crete, despite the fact, or even perhaps because of this fact, that apparently no Minoan was ever able to see a real hippo. The doubtful competence of sailors and merchants in transmitting cultural knowledge must have influenced to a certain degree the reactions of the local audience to a foreign object. This milieu of the most active agents of maritime interaction may perhaps explain some interesting cases of the perception and appreciation of foreign things and ideas. For example, The fact that among the pantheon of the Egyptian gods, it was not Osiris or Isis, but only Taweret, a lesser goddess, and perhaps Bes, the only goddesses who found their way to Crete and the Aegean, can be linked not only with the materiality and portability of their representations, in most cases small artifacts, but also with the social background of the active participants of maritime interconnections. In Egypt, these goddesses were popular among the lower classes and did not play an important role for official ideology. This was probably the Egyptian milieu of Aegean sailors and merchants. Without downplaying the importance of sailors and merchants, we should raise emissaries to a higher level, despite the fact that diplomatic gift exchange was not as regular as international trade. There is an apparent reason for this. The Amarna letters and other relevant sources inform us that most of these ambassadors had to spend at least some weeks, if not months and years, at a foreign court before they were able to travel back home. These intensive intercultural contacts at the highest echelons of the international scene must have had a much deeper impact on domestic, social, and economic structures than any trade activities, contacts, experiences, and memories of sailors and merchants. Their significance applies particularly to the case of society, politics, and administration, which are something much more complex than influences on art, iconography, or technique. These male individuals, on the right, whose name we will probably never learn, were the real protagonists of cultural interaction between both regions. And finally, the things. After having outlined the specific character of some important parameters of maritime interaction, let us focus finally on the things and start with an aspect which was rather neglected in previous research, and this is the issue of perception, which is crucial if we aspire to reconstruct ancient realities. The main problem of the traditional approach lies in the fact that the definition of foreignness has been in principle a matter of archaeological classification and not of ancient social practices. The perception of foreign objects has been reconstructed in a way which very much corresponded to a pattern of total alterity. Foreign things have been understood as alien objects maintaining the value of their otherness throughout their second life in a new cultural setting. Such analyses were therefore dominated by the implication that a foreign object remained a cultural intruder whose otherness was clearly distinguishable within a more or less homogeneous material culture. It would be, however, very naive to assume that the archaeologist's classification of these items as local versus foreign can reflect the various ways in which they were experienced by the local audience. This categorical thinking distorts rather than reflects historical reality. It is much more plausible to assume that after the cultural dislocation, imports were embedded into local practices and underwent several transformative processes, thus losing a significant portion of their otherness. There can be no doubt that imports possess the highest possible degree of visibility as foreign things at the very moment of their entry into a new culture. In this liminal stage, the import was still a foreign object, neither embedded into a local system of things and practices, nor invested with a new indigenous function and symbolic meaning. In an imaginary curve of otherness, and you see here otherness on the one bar and time, the other dimension. In this imaginary curve, the moment of the import's entry into a new culture above would represent the absolute peak of the curve. From there, the curve would fall continuously and maybe sharply down to its bottom, indicating the states of the complete domestication of the object in terms of perception and social practice. A very telling example for this transformative process, for this gradual domestication of an import, imports not an object but an image. The Egyptian Taweret and her development into the Minoan genius, which figured very prominently in Minoan and Mycenaean imagery. Already in the early stages, and what you see, the first image on the left is an Egyptian one, and then what follows are the Minoan or Aegean perception of this Egyptian goddess. From a very early stage of this transformative process, Taweret had lost a large portion of her alterity and was embedded into local practices. And in the last stage of this development, Taweret had nothing foreign at all. The issue of her foreign origin was most probably not relevant for the Aegean populations. One further interesting aspect is that the crossing of cultural borders and in the crossing of cultural borders and this process of gradual domestication, it is that this process seemed to have affected quite differently the import's design and material. While the social value of the foreign material could remain unaffected or even strikingly increased due to its distant origin and relative inaccessibility, at the same time the significance of design was dramatically diminishing. Finally, in Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean societies, in an age lacking registered trademarks, design had no clear pedigrees. The otherness of the foreign import gradually faded through redesign and regular use. The foreign material, however, restricted any transformation and was the source of the artifact's exotic aura. And since design and function are intrinsically tied to each other, this disinterest in the object's original design, and what you see here are on the right and the left two reworked Egyptian vases which were imported into Crete and reworked because their design did not satisfy the Minoan consumers, and in the middle an osprey egg, again more elaborated by Cretan artists. This disinterest in the object's original design must have gone hand in hand with a disinterest in the object's original function. Ancient objects never traveled across cultural borders with a sort of instruction manual explaining the foreign user or consumer how to use it. In some cases, local consumers did adapt the original function of the import, yet in many other cases, as it is very plausible in our context, they did not. In a transcultural setting, it becomes very obvious that an artifact cannot have a proper function, but only a system function, which can mutate in space and time. Function is thus not an intrinsic property of things, but a cultural construction. The elaboration of the concept of affordance, that means the potential uses of an object as these are defined by its physical properties, a concept which in the last couple of years has gained significance in archaeology, points to exactly the same direction. Affordance is not an absolute property of materiality, but a highly relational property. The object's material of manufacture, texture, surface, and above all shape can afford more than one functions. Turning now again to the foreign objects and their translocation into a new cultural context, it is plausible that the original function or functions become in many cases illicit or irrelevant, and the functionality of an object was set back to what one could define as a default mode after the importation into a new social context. Let me conclude. During the Middle and Bronze Age, the interaction between environment, social and political structures, channels and agents of connectivity, and finally, the circulating objects themselves shaped a very specific form of Mediterraneanism in this geographical setting. I have focused on the most tangible aspect of this interaction, namely objects and their styles and techniques. Yet we know that there must have been further, other, less tangible aspects that travel on the ships sailing across the open sea, as, if I may use a very aptly, what Annie Mikhailidou very aptly formulated, these ideas and practices traveled like blind passengers in the seas, in the vessels, together with the objects. So the words in the white color refer to the items which we can document more or less well, but we have the practices and the ideas and knowledge which unfortunately not tangible, or at least not directly tangible. And of course it is interesting, it's of course interesting to spend some thoughts about the perception and consumption of foreign objects in Minoan Crete. But what about the big questions that have been put again and again in the past decades? How decisive was the impact of the East on the development of Minoan culture? Did the idea of writing or of the palaces come from Egypt or even the Near East? We all know that it's not very easy to answer these questions, and it is perhaps not even necessary. Our Heidelberg research group, covering a very broad temporal and spatial frame, is dealing with a traditional and problematic notion of culture. One of its main objectives is to demonstrate that traditional narratives based on supposedly clearly defined cultures located in specific territories with clear-cut out boundaries, in other words, cultures which form closed and separated entities coming into contact to each other and exercising different forms of influences, are a very static and in many cases misleading explanatory model for understanding cultural processes and interaction. The alternative model is based on the concept of transculturality, which introduces a dynamic understanding of cultures and their plurality of forms. Our focus lies therefore not on territories or cultural entities, but on border-crossing processes. The main objective is to reconstruct circulatory patterns, issues of processuality, and shifts in practices, ideologies, and social values in a transcultural setting. It is actually not that important whether the idea of writing or sealing came from the East. It is much more fruitful to see how these ideas developed in the local context and to reconstruct their trajectories in Minoan history. Be that as it may, Crete provides an impressive example for the sea as motor of cultural evolution. This geographical element, which is always associated with openness, liberation, innovation and change, was definitely one of the reasons why Minoan culture still is and will be not only an object of scientific inquiry and research, but also of our admiration. Thank you very much.